And whilst they do that, so I'm really delighted to be able to welcome such a distinguished panel to our Centre for Contemporary Literature here at Birkbeck. We've all come together to discuss Professor Tom Moylan's new book, Becoming Utopian, The Culture and Politics of Radical Transformation. And with us then we have Professor Raffaella Baccolini.
Hi.
From her office, Heather McKnight.
Hello.
From, I think, somewhere near me, actually, in Brighton, perhaps down in the south. Okay. Professor Baccolini joins us from Bologna. Professor Tom Moylan over in Limerick.
Hello.
Hiya. And Dr. Tim Waterman as well.
Hello.
Hi, Tim. And we were also joined by my colleague, Professor Martin Eve, who is here to moderate for us. So just before I introduce everybody and get things started, a couple of digital housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, and we will make that recording available after this event in case anybody has Wi-Fi or connectivity issues and maybe drops out. Also, just to note, please could you keep your microphones muted? It's quite easy to do. There should be a little panel of buttons at the bottom of your screen with a mic and a camera. And it really makes a difference to the sound quality if everyone is muted, including our speakers, when they're not talking. We'll be speaking for about 50 minutes, I hope, up to an hour. And then we have the remaining hour for a lively conversation. And we're really pleased to see so many friends and colleagues joining us from the UK and other parts of the world. So it would be lovely if you could gather your thoughts and actually maybe turn on your microphones and cameras when that time comes, and we can have a really engaged discussion with everybody who's here tonight. And my colleague Martin will be monitoring chat, so if you'd rather just text or type your questions, or your microphone isn't working for some reason, then please do that and Martin can feed them back to us. So let me just introduce Tom first, and then his book. I'm sure he doesn't need any introduction to many of you, but just in case you're not already aware, or let's remind ourselves, he is the Glucksman Professor Emeritus in the School of English, Irish and Communication, and he also lectures in the School of Architecture at the University of Limerick. He's the founder of the Ralahine Centre for Utopian Studies, which has been really transformational in bringing more institutional energies to utopian scholarship in Europe. And he's also been a key figure in the Society for Utopian Studies in the US and the Utopian Studies Society in Europe. His publications include the book, I've got my old copy here, Demand the Impossible, Science Fiction and the Utopian Imagination. I really love that cover. Back in 1986, I think it was first published. Is that right, Tom? And Utopia Method Vision, The Use Value of Social Dreaming, and also Dark Horizons, Science Fiction and the Dystopian Imagination, which he co-wrote and edited, with Raffaella, who's with us tonight. And he also edited Exploring the Utopian Impulse, Essays on Utopian Thought and Practice. Tom is a really key figure for those of us who work in the interdisciplinary field of utopian studies, and I think everybody here would agree that he's had a really important impact on all of our work, so I am particularly honoured and delighted to be welcoming him. And his new book, Becoming Utopian, which we'll be discussing tonight, is really a collection of essays that have been edited and repackaged, dating back, I think I'm right in saying, to the mid-1980s until recently. And it's an astonishing read, really fabulous book, exploring the utopian process in its individual and collective trajectory from dream to realization, encompassing things like liberation theology, ecological activism, and radical pedagogy. Please excuse some screaming in the background. My toddler has just got home, but nevertheless, we will continue. So I'll just briefly introduce our panel, and then what we're going to do is everybody's going to speak with a short presentation of around 10 minutes, followed by Tom himself, who will, I think, give some thoughts and responses before we open the discussion up. So first up, we are going to hear from Professor Raffaella Baccolini. Raffaella is full professor in the Department of Interpreting and Translation and the coordinator of the PhD program at the University of Bologna. Her research interests include contemporary and 20th century American and English literature, as well as gender studies, and she's published incredibly widely on women's literature, feminist criticism, utopia, dystopia, and science fiction. She's an important collaborator with the Peter Lang book series of utopian studies, which publishes work produced in association with the Ralahine Centre for Utopian Studies at Limerick. And she has edited Utopian Method Vision with Tom, and also Dark Horizons, and other texts on literature, gender, and education for children and young adults. And the forthcoming book, which I believe is out later this year, Transgressive Utopianism, Essays in Honour of Lucy Sargison, who I think might even be with us. So we're very much looking forward to hearing more about that. Next up on our panel is Tim Waterman, Dr. Tim Waterman, who is Associate Professor of Landscape Theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London. His research addresses imaginaries, moral, political, social, ecological, radical, and utopian. He is the chair of the Landscape Research Group, vice president of the European Council of Landscape Architecture Schools, and a non-executive director of the digital arts collective Furtherfield. And Tim's work, he's published all kinds of things to do with architecture, landscape, and utopianism, including a collection edited with Jane Wolfe and Ed Wall called Landscape Citizenships, which is coming out in May of this year. Also, two other edited books, Landscape and Agency, Critical Essays with Ed Wall, and the Routledge Handbook of Landscape and Food with Joshua Zunert. And a collection of Tim's own essays, The Landscape of Utopia, is forthcoming from Routledge, hopefully quite soon. Next, we're going to hear from Heather McKnight, who is a utopian scholar, activist, and community worker. Heather's interests include the utopianism of activism, unionism, education, gender, feminism, and television studies. And she is currently a doctoral researcher at the University of Sussex Law Department. And congratulations to Heather, because I think she recently completed her thesis, which looks at how joint working between trade unions and student unions produce new articulations of academic freedom, and how these can challenge marketized structures in higher education. Heather has published articles on the utopian narratives of the school strikes for climate crisis, nano-utopian activism in times of chaos, and joint union campus activism. And she's the current editor of the Chase Feminist Network Lockdown blog and founder of the Magnetic Ideals Collective. And then lastly, you're going to hear from me, and I realised I should have introduced myself first, apologies. I'm Dr. Caroline Edwards. I'm a senior lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at Birkbeck, and I'm the director of the Centre for Contemporary Literature. My first book, which came out last year with Cambridge University Press, is called Utopia and the Contemporary British Novel, and I've published on contemporary literary studies, utopianism and science fiction. And right now I'm working on a second book and editing the Cambridge Companion to Utopian Literature and Culture, 1945 to 2018, and that will be out in 2 years' time with Cambridge. So I'm going to hand over to Raffaella, if I may, and I will mute myself. Raffaella, are you ready?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for your introduction, for inviting me here. And thanks also to Tom, Tim, and Heather for being part of this. And of course, thanks for all of you who have joined us tonight. I'm also grateful to be here because Tom's book is a significant contribution and a testimony to the importance of critical thinking, hope, and utopia in these very dark times. And it does so by entering in a very fruitful engagement with theory, by establishing a dialogue with a number of critics and thinkers that obviously includes some of the more established scholars in the field, but also the emergent ones, in a kind of generosity and pioneering attitude that is typical of Tom's scholarship. In tracing his own utopian turn and the subsequent development of his utopian vocation and method in the personal, political, and professional dimensions of his life, Tom's book becomes a tribute to the scholars who have contributed to the development of the field and his own formation, in a sort of map of a collective construction, a shared collective project. What I would like to do in my 10 or so minutes is to touch on a number of words and concepts that have particularly struck me as I read the new parts of Tom's book and reread the chapters that I already knew. Some of these words to me are like keywords in Tom's critical approach and are all fundamental to the process of becoming utopian. Some of the most relevant words are break, the utopian break, and the Gestalt shift, radical and radicalized individual, utopian desire, the education of that utopian desire, collective solidarity and action, compassion and cooperation, and also humanity and nature. I haven't listed hope, but hope is obviously fundamental and resonates throughout the book. And to start, I would like to read a passage from the introduction that I think includes most of these words, and clearly traces what becoming utopian entails. And I quote, "Becoming utopian names the trajectory of social subjects who break with their compliant formation, having come to relearn the world and to imagine that it could be radically other. In this development, each new radicalized individual, imbued with utopian desire, can, with others, engage in an education of that desire and enter into a radical utopian structure of feeling that nurtures collective solidarity and action in anticipatory harmony with all humanity and all of nature. This collective movement rises out of each person and is informed by each, even as they are formed by that movement. Furthermore, the self-conscious and self-reflective dialectical process of individual and collective formation can be enhanced, indeed preserved and strengthened, by maintaining the self-reflexive and self-critical capacity of the utopian impulse to work against the grain of what is, in the name of what could be better, even within the movement, even within a realized victory." End quote. At a time when we're facing an output of dark narratives that too often coalesce in what Vandana Singh has called a dystopia porn, Tom notices that these texts fail to provoke the prophetic awakening of which the dystopian imagination is capable. But if we were to put together all these words, we would come up with a description of what some of the most interesting critical dystopias of today are still doing. We are reading texts that are set in the near future, almost in our present. These are texts that formally and thematically present the narratives of fragmented individuals whose actions and choices affect the collectivity. In solidarity and cooperation with others, these characters are staying with the trouble, to use Donna Haraway's famous title, which Tom himself refers to, thus forming new alliances among human beings and also with nature and all species. One of the points on which Tom insists most is the relationship between the individual and his or her Gestalt shift or break and the collective that makes the becoming utopian possible, or that forces, as Tom says, the impossible into the possible. For Tom, following Jody Dean and Kathy Weeks, the radicalized individual, the utopian subject, is embodied by the figure of the comrade, a preferred term over communist, the radical person who works in the world for something better. The comrade is the carrier of the utopian longings who works collectively and is a figure of political belonging. Allow me a brief digression on the term comrade. Although I find Tom's employment of Dean and Weeks effective and convincing, I almost have to catch myself every time I hear the word. I obviously know what it means, but in Italian, the word is a loaded one. In Italian, in fact, the word that most resembles comrade is camerata. It was and still is used by fascist and extremist right-wing groups. The word comes from the Spanish camarada, or chambermate, as well as the Latin camera, chamber or room. And since the end of the 19th century, it has been used by socialists and communists alike. The word for comrade in Italian is instead compagno or compagna, depending whether you're a male or female, meaning companion, from the Latin cum and panis, that is, with bread, the one who shares bread, the one who eats bread together. This word is used in left-wing circles, so using one word or the other is, in Italian, a quick way to reveal and declare one's political views. But my digression aside, the figure of the comrade embodies a tension between the collective, the need of belonging, and of a unified political organization, and individual discomfort, a wrong in one's life and in one's world, that the utopian longing is attempting to change. This tension is epitomized by the break, the gestalt shift of the social subject, the radicalized individual, with utopian desire. In his reading of the process of becoming utopian, Tom has no room for nostalgia. He warns here and elsewhere in the book against the danger of indulging in nostalgia and how we cannot afford it. Although I think that Tom and I ultimately agree, I think he does away with nostalgia a little too quickly and apparently misses the utopian potential of nostalgia. And I'm wondering if this is something he would reconsider perhaps or address in his comment. Also in light of the reading of Darko's poem in chapter 4, or when we think about nostalgia in critical dystopias, like, for example, Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, or even Joanna Russ's When It Changed. Traditionally viewed as a type of conservative or merely regressive memory, nostalgia often serves to reinstate traditional values. By the narrative process of nostalgic reconstruction, says Susan Stewart, the present is denied and the past takes on an authenticity of being. Essentially history without guilt for Michael Kamen, for Svetlana Boym, nostalgia is an abdication of personal responsibility. But I think that a reassessment of nostalgia is due, as I believe, and I think that Tom believes it too, that, and I'm quoting Boym again, longing and critical thinking are not opposed to one another, as effective memories do not absolve one from compassion, judgment, or critical reflection, unquote. But I would go even further and say that nostalgia can share with the process of becoming utopian some important features. Both are informed by desire. It is desire for a better change that moves utopia, and it is desire for a lost place and a lost time that characterizes nostalgia. In addition, nostalgia and utopian tradition are connected through displacement. While utopia leaves its readers and visitors displaced, suspended between the knowledge and re-examination of their society and the discovery of the new one, nostalgia similarly evokes displacement, the loss of a place or a time in those who experience it. Nostalgia then can be seen as the refusal to let go of the past in its attempt to recover the irretrievable and to open a space for the possible. The combination of desire and estrangement and the presence of algia, the discomfort or pain, all informed by a revisionist approach, can turn nostalgia to a critical re-examination of the past and present, and thus render it as an important stimulus for a desire for change. In this sense, as I've said elsewhere, there can be a connection between the nevermore of nostalgia and the not yet of utopia. The desire for something irretrievable that can only begin to find its realization in what is still to be accomplished. And here I want to acknowledge the work of Elspeth Brobin, who in Outside Belongings urges us to use nostalgia in the telling of our stories, she says, with the fervor of the possible, not the implacability of truth-telling. There are two more words that I would like to discuss. One is compassion, and the other is responsibility. While the first is present in the introduction and throughout the book, the other appears in several chapters, especially those on liberation theology, but not in the introduction, and yet it is equally relevant to Tom's becoming utopian process. Tom insists that we must work from where we are in a manner that is compassionate and cooperative, doing so with each other and with all of nature. Compassion and solidarity resonate throughout the text and are a fundamental component of the radical change that the utopian subject is trying to enact. It is a vital dimension of being an activist, which in Tom's case is also linked to his being a teacher. About teaching, he says that it is, and I quote, a matter of imparting knowledge in the context of facilitating with compassion a learning process that helps each individual break with their normative development and come to see the world freshly in order to develop a responsible sense of their place and path in that world, unquote. In my own work, I have claimed that kindness can become a revolutionary act in a world characterized by selfishness and hatred, as the times in which we are living are. I have preferred and reappropriated the term kindness because kindness has been largely feminized and devalued in our culture in its association with tenderness. It has become a sign of weakness, so much so that a lot of people today believe that kindness is a virtue of losers. And to me, the former, thank God, United States President Donald Trump strikes me as probably, one of the great examples of a person who promotes the idea that kindness is weakness. If you think about his infamous refrain, you're fired, that epitomizes the pleasure of hurting another. Compassion and responsibility are often associated in Tom's book. Becoming utopian entails the development of a new habit of mind so we can leave, and these are Tom's words, our hegemonic humanity behind and act with awareness and responsibility, with compassion, with compassion and cooperation as part of a healed and revived nature. And again, individual and collective merge when discussing Kim Stanley Robinson's dialectics of ecology. He says that on a personal level, each of us needs to act responsibly in the moment, doing our share of good practice, however much it is encased within the prevailing economy and ideology. But collectively and diversely, we need to develop a radical ecological consciousness and behavior. Referring to the work of Paulo Freire, Tom recalls how the aim of Freire's pedagogical method is not the production of a once-off revolutionary moment, but rather a permanent effort to exercise humanity's creative potential and responsibilities at each historical stage. Acting responsibly is also taking care of the other, recognizing our interdependence and being aware. As Ursula K. Le Guin has said, if you cannot or will not imagine the results of your actions, there is no way you can act morally or responsibly. Tom's extended reflection on becoming utopian addresses just what Le Guin says. It is therefore a way to engage with the pressing question of radical political responsibility, of what is to be done to prevent our dark times to develop into what Bloch has called the devastatingly possible is nothing. I would like to close with the image that Tom uses of reading as the subtle knife from Philip Pullman's Dark Materials trilogy, to stress once again what I think is one of the strengths of Tom's process, the need and importance of critical thinking, serious and deep reading that aims at transforming and not only critiquing. Such critical dystopian and utopian hermeneutic is necessary, and it must be used even with what we have called commercial dystopias, so that readers can, and I quote one of my favorite sentences from Tom's book, so that readers can look at how a utopian literary text thinks and teaches with its form and its content, how it develops the capacity to think and act otherwise, how it evokes the warm stream of hope as well as the cold stream of critique. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raffaella. Okay, Tim, are you ready to speak next?
Yes, just
Tim?
getting my video working again.
Yeah, of course.
For some reason, it asks me twice on here. Okay, I think all systems go?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say it's such a great pleasure and an honor to be here in such good company, both in this distinguished panel and all those warm presences in the audience. So I'm just going to share my screen because I have a slideshow. And hopefully this will all work seamlessly as it's supposed to. Great. So Tom invited us to speak to the book, around it, through it. And I think in many ways this book is both a very sane and careful examination of utopianism, but it's also a call to action. One of the things that has been a characteristic, I think, of being in lockdown in London is that I've spent a lot of time in my memory, actually, searching through the past. And so actually what I'd like to do is to share some memories of activism and perhaps talk about the emergence of myself as a utopian subject in precisely the way that Tom speaks about in his book, Becoming Utopian. So I'm starting here with the sort of door-to-door image, and this is when I was searching for an image of proselytizing at the door. The one that came up that I thought was most representative was from the Jehovah's Witnesses website. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses are actually quite interesting in that the core to the religion is, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. We're just seeing a black screen at the moment. I wondered if you could, there we go, that's it, perfect, thank you.
Okay, so it's what you're going to end up seeing then, I guess, is that you can't see it full screen, so you'll have to see all my clutter around the sides, I'm afraid, but that's what it will have to be. Okay, so the image then is of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The idea of Armageddon, I think, is a really interesting one to look at from a utopian perspective, because the idea of the apocalypse is so much at the core of both utopias and dystopias. And of course, it's also at the core of contemporary thinking, as was mentioned earlier, Donna Haraway asking us to stay with the trouble of the apocalypse that we're living in. So all of that very interesting. I think too, this image of going door to door speaks to a reluctance on the left to engage in proselytizing, propagandizing, and taste making. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why we have so often been seeming to lose our long battle with the right. So what I'd like to do is take the opportunity to use Tom's chapter in this book on the utopian standpoint of nonviolence, which I was lucky enough to hear him give as an address in Newcastle some years ago. And I want to talk about, through the act of intellectual biography, which is part of what Tom is doing as well. And I think it's important to speak from our own bodies, our real bodies in real places, as ways of situating activism and making it real and telling great stories. So I'm going to talk about what happened in Oregon in 1992. And this was my first, not my first experience of activism, but my first really immersive experience of activism. I had done a little bit around supporting Cesar Chavez and fighting against U.S. intervention in El Salvador and things like that. But this was a movement that grabbed me by my lapels and dragged me along. So Ballot Measure 9 was an initiative of the Oregon Citizens Alliance, which was a far-right, religious right group which sought to, through a ballot initiative in the state of Oregon, ban the teaching and what they called the promotion of homosexuality in the state of Oregon. So it was one of these kind of early test cases. And one of the things that you see kind of repeatedly through this is that they use this really inflammatory language that conflates homosexuality and gay lifestyles immediately with sadism, masochism, pedophilia. You know, they kind of wrap all of this stuff together. And this was the protagonist of the Oregon Citizens Alliance, a man named Lon Mabon. And Mabon was actually a very canny campaigner, and took the OCA basically door to door and speaking to people heart to heart, and really speaking to issues that affected people, but also projecting this kind of toxic, exclusionary, right-wing utopia. So there was our utopia on the left pitted against this very reactionary utopia on the right. And of course, what we saw in Oregon at that time is that it was inflammatory and people were stirred up in ways that were really horrific. So there were people that died in fire bombings. There were colleagues of mine who had the brake lines cut on their car. There was a lot of violence that associated with this along the way. And the strategy of the right was to go out to people and talk about this idea of special rights, and that gays and lesbians were somehow being accorded rights that heterosexual people did not. So a special sort of sense of privilege. And they also used this, you know, kind of pack of lies. Really, they believed in the kind of fundamental truth of all of this. And I think it's also something that we see in the right wing, that they're so convinced of the core of their truth that they're willing to wrap things up in a tissue of lies, and that somehow they can hold that in all at one go. So I was also a participant in this something called the Walk for Love and Justice. Not well named, I think, in a way, because love and justice are both ideas that the right subscribes to as well. You know, love of country, love of whiteness, and justice, you know, has a kind of sense of retribution about it. But you can actually see me in the image here. I'm somewhere about halfway down the line there, the tall man in sunglasses wearing a rucksack. And I was part of the filming crew as well for this film called Ballot Measure 9, which you can see on canopy.com if you happen to have a subscription to that. And there's me, my 20-something-year-old self on that walk. What looking at this really brings back to me is actually a real sense of both the incredible camaraderie, the idea of the comrade that Raffaella just spoke to, but also the intensity of the fear that was associated with that. There's nothing to make you feel so exposed and vulnerable as an atmosphere of hatred and knowing the vulnerability of your body is out there on the street. But that is the power of nonviolent protest, is the willingness to make your body vulnerable in a very public way and in a public space. So the Walk for Love and Justice got a lot of news coverage, and when we finally arrived from our walk across Oregon into the city of Portland, Oregon, we arrived just in time to be at the very front of the Gay Pride Parade that year. And I can totally recommend the experience of leading a parade. Everyone should do that. We probably need more parades as well. So here's me as well in the film, in a section where we're looking at, we're at a police briefing where we're talking about the death threats that the No on 9 campaign has received. And indeed, you know, my roommate and I had death threats on our phone. There were, you know, the offices of No on 9 were broken into and vandalized. It was a terrifying time. But I just want to read here, I think this is just the place to read a line from Becoming Utopian. And this is from the section Next Steps, Tracking the Utopian Method. And I love the power of this line here. And here's me, the utopian subject. Reaching back to my core concern in this book, Tom writes, there remains a central element to complete this equation, and that is the human person, and by extension, human community, who is or could be engaged in the process of becoming utopian. For what I'm concerned with is not an abstract model or a disembodied study. Rather, if utopia is to matter, it has to be regarded as the product not just of structural conditions, but of personal and collective knowledge and action of utopian praxis. So this short talk, I think, takes Tom's work and mobilizes it as he would want, asks for people to become utopian in the streets, and also to become utopian door to door, that actually we have to not assume that our superior research gives us the platform that we need. We have to be able to get out and speak to people in their own language and not just in academic terms. Right, so that is, let's see if I can stop sharing now. I can't find the button.
Thank you, Tim. I think I've just done it, actually.
Great.
Thank you so much. Such a powerful personal account there as well. Okay, so next up we've got Heather. Are you ready to go, Heather?
Yes, I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much, and thank you for having me on this panel. I feel very honoured to be here with such a distinguished group of people. I do think it speaks to the kindness and openness of the utopian movement that I'm here. I agree with Tim that this book did take me on quite a reflective journey. My MA dissertation was on Bloch and called Daydreams of Becoming Human. I took the idea of utopianism as a discursive exterior from one of Moylan's writings. I think some people in my department thought I was less than academic for my tentatively optimistic rather than bleakly critical approach. I was later asked in one of many PhD interviews to explain my thesis proposal without mentioning the word hope. The word hope said with some degree of disgust. My attempt to rescue utopia from what Tom Moylan describes in his book as its negative connotation of useless dreaming had clearly not worked in this instance. I wish I had this book on becoming utopian then. Perhaps then I would have viewed that question as an example of the erasure and enclosure of the utopian proclivity, that all too familiar sense of the censorship of hope itself that Tom describes at the start of the text. The book Being Utopian is not just a prescient critical engagement and a call to arms, but also a companion to read it, and to read it feels like it heals wounds inflicted against those of us who dare to hope, who cause trouble and stay with it, and as Tom Moylan notes, to do the dangerous work of utopian transformation, or at least, which I think really speaks to what Tim was just speaking about there, or at least to try to do such work in these difficult times, and in complicity with the systems in which we necessarily exist. As such, presenting here an engagement with the text that is more emotional and personal than it is critical and technical. Tom Moylan hopes, and I quote, his entire project will speak to those who are experiencing an initial utopian break and seeking to locate themselves for the longer path, as well as to those working to contextualize their own development beyond that utopian turn. I feel that this emotional engagement is because I'm at this initial break, a break in many senses, a break between submission and viva, between being an official part of academia with access to resources and not, between even deciding whether I want to continue becoming utopian within or out with the now somewhat ethereal digital walls of the academy. Tom Moylan knows that his core concern in his book is the human person, and by extension human community who is or could be engaged in the process of becoming utopian. So to some extent, my choice to break or not from academia is immaterial. Fundamentally, this book asks us to realize that becoming utopian is not just an academic pursuit. It's a way of being and acting that exists and reaches outside of the academy and turns back and criticizes it. Key to this, Moylan includes in his book the artist Susan Brown's report to an academy and the Coda 68 and the Utopian imagination at the end of the book, to make us think of matters of neoliberal university, academic freedom, protest, and their role in relation to becoming utopian. What does becoming utopian mean for utopians in the current academic environment? The recent pressure vessels reports by Liz Moorish speak about the declining mental health of all university staff who are experiencing excessive workloads, insecure employment, punitive metric-driven performance management policies. The report recognised the mental health of professional services staff, including catering, cleaning, HR, security support staff, to name but a few, who, as Silvia Federici notes, are the invisible roots of knowledge production that we too often forget. Here, Tom Moylan's inclusion of Susan Brown's report to an academy is particularly pertinent. It is about the interdependency of workers and work, of being and becoming. Her artwork is on the front cover, an octopus, a shot from her video piece. Brown does a modern take on Kafka's report to the academy. She explains how she contorts herself trying to conform to the neoliberal demands of the academy. She has a feeling of being unable to use her tongue to form words that can be heard by colleagues or management, and finally finds herself turning into an octopus with a whole new sensory world and understanding. I do recommend contacting her. As recommended in the text, watch the films, it's fantastic. The professional services staff who reproduce the environment and academic infrastructure are frequently undervalued, but the way that they're recognised in Brown's narrative is pivotal. There is a recognition of the role of the cleaners of the academy, and the narrative, such as the cleaners that take her in a bucket in her octopus form to the management to give her final report. They also remind her and us of previous industrial action staff have taken. And I think that's something that Tom's book's trying to do as well, is that idea of kind of looking back at kind of how can we use the tools of kind of previous radical actions. In the UK, we're all very aware of the union strikes and the related action happening over the last few years for academic and academic-related staff. But how many of us realised that in November 2020, there was the biggest ever strike in the UK by outsourced workers in higher education that was organised by the Independent Workers' Union? Brown describes how the cleaners initially curdle in shock when they find her in her octopus form. And this can't help but reminds me of Kev Bloch in The Spirit of Utopia, who speaks of academics and says, to see us is to want to vomit. He at the same time notes, who are we that we pass so unsuspectingly by each other? Brown's work demonstrates the ways that we fail at the basics of recognition, listening, or rather hearing, and certainly of caring in academia. I think the inclusion of such a kind of visceral and embodied chapter in this way, becoming utopian, it brings us back into ourselves, and there's a sense of discomfort. There's a material embodied nature to this and to resistance itself. This brings me back to the kind of Coda 68 in the Utopian imagination, and Tom Moylan's discussion of both his academic and activist roles. In this chapter, we hear his discomfort with defining as an academic, as he resists becoming a kind of high-end product of a broken capitalist academic system, and tries instead to occupy a different kind of space that allows for more agency and disruption, and discusses how his activism integrates not into just what he teaches, but how. He speaks of how his utopianism has roots in this activism, and I quote from the book, the triple sense of how we can live in the world by means of commitment to understand the totality of the world system, to transgress as much as possible, to change its unjust and unfree structures, and to transform reality into a better place for all humanity and all of nature. Going back to the report to an academy, Brown notes quite accurately that academic freedom is a freedom to be deceived by. However, in the space of utopian possibility created at the end of her text, and its spirit of Moylan's book more generally, perhaps as part of our utopian project, we should lay claim to the term academic freedom as a utopian one that is fundamental to a history of activism in the academy, and that can connect with non-violent forms of resistance and cooperation. This different ideal of academic freedom partially reaches back to earlier notions of more transgressive academic freedom, more prevalent in the trade union and students' union movements of the late 60s and early 70s, a time that Tom refers to as an alternative reality. Times that saw the right to industrial action and protest as central to academic freedom rather than its enemy. New narratives around this open form of academic freedom must recognise the coloniality of the university itself and the dangers of hierarchy. And you see discussions happening between staff and students at strikes and protests for the last few years in relation to academic freedom, and particularly in relation to like prevent anti-terrorism guidance that Tom kind of refers to briefly within his book. Perhaps it is through this kind of joint working in spaces of resistance between all staff and students and the outside of academia that there's a possibility of reclaiming a different type of freedom, one that has utopian potential to transform rather than oppress, that creates political as well as pedagogical change. For this to become utopian, we need to hear voices outside of the exclusivity of the academy, as well as become critical within it. In order to once more access what Moylan refers to, although not uncritically, as the richly layered spatio-temporal moment in the academia of the 1970s, where, I quote again, intellectual and cultural practice moved between the academy and other social formations without barriers, silos, and cages that have become all too common. Part of what we must do is we're being called to recognise that there are no edges to academia. It is caught up in the reproduction of the university by all workers, including student workers and all people in society, connected to nature, from the carbon footprints of the universities to their dialogue of the climate crisis, and training by unions of climate activists, through art and culture that need not be sanctioned. There are quasi-academic spaces of resistance in the free university movement and alternative academic movements, and students and staff activism, be it supported by official unions or not. In this new space where we can sense each other and hear each other and not pass the ones particularly by each other, the possibility of becoming utopian glistens. As it is indeed, as Tom Moylan notes, a necessarily collective and compassionate process. So to end back at the beginning, with this book as a companion, Tom starts his first chapter on strong thoughts with, "It seems I've always lived between worlds." As someone who grew up being asked by people in my own hometown where I was actually from, that really resonated. It seems the spaces at the edges and in between are where utopians currently reside. What Tom's book has done through the injection of the personal narrative and experiences alongside theoretical has for the first time made me feel like a normal something. In particular, a kind of normal utopian, whatever that means, kind of a strange feeling of belonging. Part of what this book emphasises, and also what I've experienced generally from my engagement with the utopian movement, is that part of becoming utopian is holding the space open for other becoming utopians. It's, as Raffaella was mentioning, a kind of radical kindness. The generosity of spirit from Caroline and Tom and other utopians to numerous dimensions is why I've not already shrunk away from this dark and troubling world of academia. Tom Moylan notes in his book, "Given the insufficiency of any present moment, it is important to acknowledge that the capacity to infuse a utopian impulse within a structure of feeling is always available. The idea that we can and must start from where we are and must realise we have with us this present moment, this utopian resource, is central to this book. It is this that makes the impossible possible. So I sit now and I feel this belonging. In this strange feeling of normality, as Tom calls it, feeling like a radical utopian stranger in a familiar land. This book makes concrete for me the realization that many of you have probably already had, that perhaps as more people embrace this ongoing process of becoming utopian, that we will create a ripple effect as a necessary part of that radical and connected process. That perhaps the becoming utopians and all their diversities, held in their conflicted spaces and their varying radical practices, can become the norm instead of the exception. To imagine having most of the people in the world hoping things can be better and acting on it, listening to each other and working together and educating each other in how this is possible. It feels almost mundane, almost here, something to hope for as well as to become. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Heather. It's so weird, isn't it, presenting online and not being able to applaud really loudly after each speaker. Yeah, what a beautiful, impassioned contribution there. Okay, so I'd like to describe some of my personal responses to Tom's work, and also come back to the dangerous work that Tim and Heather have signalled, and the sense of trying to hold open these spaces of resistance. So in this new book then, Becoming Utopian, Tom Moylan describes the ongoing process and the hard work of becoming utopian as beginning with a ruptural moment of self-conscious recognition. I think Raffaella was describing in her talk this idea of rupture, and that the world must be relearned and that it can become radically other, what Gestalt psychology would call the aha moment. Like Alain Badiou's revolutionary break in the event, which makes possible a transformation of relations between the possible and the impossible, like the education of desire that Ruth Levitas interrogates in her influential commitment to thinking utopia as method, which draws on E.P. Thompson's studies of William Morris and also ideas developed by Raymond Williams. Like Paolo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and Donna Haraway's staying with the trouble in our contemporary historical moment of dark times, Moylan's sustained intellectual and political commitment to utopia is grounded in the dialectical movement between, on the one hand, the negation of the present situation, and it's a situation now that is so catastrophic, we might describe it, as Darko Suvin does, as, and I quote, this dog-turd universe which offends basic decency. And Tom memorably cites that line, which comes from one of Darko's poems, Growing Old Without Yugoslavia. And then on the other hand, the positive anticipation of a better possible world, the process of denunciation and annunciation as liberal theologians frame the problem. And Tom has an extended engagement with liberation theology, and particularly Ernst Bloch's importance to liberation theologists in Europe and Latin and North America in the book. As Tom writes in the first chapter, which is titled Strong Thoughts, Utopia Pedagogy Agency, and I quote, in this development of becoming utopian, each newly radicalized individual imbued with utopian desire can, with others, engage in an education of that desire and enter into a radical utopian structure of feeling that nurtures collective solidarity and action in anticipatory harmony with all humanity and all of nature. And I wanted to take my point of departure and my engagement with the book with that idea of humanity and all of nature, and the complications around human nature as a part of the natural environment and ecological systems. Bertolt Brecht's short Organon for the theatre is relevant here, and Moylan cites Brecht's formulation of the smallest social unit, which is not the single person, but two people. For in life too, we develop one another. And so if we are to usefully grow our own radicalized subjectivity into overt political action, Tom writes, we must come together, we must act collectively. So I wanted to start here in the traditional Marxist problematic of how we mediate between atomized, alienated, consumerist individual subjects and collectivity proper. It's central, I think, to Moylan's utopian project and to that of Frederick Jameson's dialectical criticism. And I suspect that all of us who work in this tradition, particularly within literary studies, including colleagues such as Phil Wegner, who I hope is with us tonight, explore this problem of mediation in one way or another. In The Political Unconscious, Jameson uses it to structure his depth model of literary excavation of the political impulse, which moves outwards from a text symbolic act, which is read at the smallest social unit, the level of the social, and then into its entrance into class discourse, which expands to the level of the political at a particular moment in time. And then it's finally its position within the ideology of form, which expresses the historical significance of a literary genus. And this, for Jameson, is history in totem. And the imaginary or formal solutions that the text may pose in response to the social contradictions of its own time. Jean-Luc Nancy's important philosophy of the being with, as expounded in Being Singular Plural, Être Singulier Pluriel, argues that being, the primary terrain through which we come to know our own subjectivity, cannot be anything but being with one another. circulating in the with and as the with of this singularly plural coexistence, as he writes. So there's no meaningful existence in isolation, and categories which privilege singularity at the expense of collective relations cannot offer us a useful account of being. And this being with, as Nancy describes it, bursts asunder our lived temporal relations, coursing, as he writes, and I quote, in all the directions of all the space-times, opened by presence to presence, all things, all beings, all entities, everything past and future, alive, dead, inanimate, end quote. And of course, we can find this kind of polyvalent collective temporality in lots of texts throughout the kind of Marxist tradition, if you like. Places like Walter Benjamin's Redemption of History via a weak messianic power, in Ernst Bloch's massive utopian oeuvre, in Mark Fisher's cultural analyses of the function of anachronistic forms, and in the network cycles of struggle charted in Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's project in Empire, Multitude and Commonwealth. More recently, I've started to try and formulate a particular kind of utopian post-humanism, or even possibly a utopian anti-humanism, for thinking through the way in which utopian possibility has resurfaced in contemporary literary, cinematic, digital works and site-specific art installations. These aren't Jameson's utopian enclaves within the text, although they do, I think, but I'm still trying to work it out, I think they do stage the negative and the positive utopian hermeneutic that Tom Moylan describes. But in order to do so, what I'm fascinated by is the way in which they dissolve the humanist subject in its entirety. So, for example, in mycological fictions and works of non-fictions about the study of mushrooms and mycelium, which give us mycelial utopian possibility when the human subject becomes infected and remade within and beyond capitalist extractivism amidst the wreckage and the ruin. And there's an obvious political metaphor for activism here in the kind of liberation of spores that radical mycologists describe as their project. Or perhaps in the queering of the subject via accounts of hydrofeminism, such as the pregnant post-humans, who are always more than one subject, and whose viscous uterine fluids connect humans with other bodies of water facing similar crises in a gestational moment of watery collectivity. As Astrida Naimanis writes then, the descriptions of breastfeeding in Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born connects her directly to her infant, but also to other bodies across time. And similarly, Rodanta van der Waal suggests that the pregnant woman is the daughter of Donna Haraway's cyborg and Rosie Braidotti's post-human. She is a singular subject, but inside her subjectivity, there is another subject growing, one that nobody can see yet. She is in a singular plural state. Coming back to the personal narrative, which we've heard from Tim particularly, and Heather too, I guess it's no coincidence that I started thinking a lot more about pregnancy and uterine collectivity during my own pregnancy and my own journey into post-humanist ecological thinking. But I think we can also find it in the so-called rock aesthetics of Black utopian studies, which brings a powerful sense of utopian apocalyptic urgency. Black and Indigenous worlds have, after all, been ending for centuries. And they bring this to bear on the proximity between Black and brown bodies and the geological fossil objects that they have laboured to extract and whose inhuman categorisation they might use, or they might indeed weaponise, to refer back to Mark Fisher's idea of anachronism as a weapon. And they can weaponise this then through substratal compressions of millennia of life and energy that vastly exceeds anthropocentric time. And my example here would be the popular trilogy Broken Earth by N.K. Jemisin. So as Tom writes then, in our time, he says, there are new energies provoking utopia's radical vision that the knots of sheer atrophy have been slightly loosened by emergent conditions in this dangerously destructive moment. And for me, actually, one of the most exciting and interesting chapters, I mean, all of the chapters are fabulous, but there was an extended passage where Tom engages with Frederick Jameson's kind of knotty, thorny, problematic relationship with utopia throughout his own career, and his tendency to perhaps be a little less optimistic in the way in which he circumscribes formal properties of utopian literature and utopian enclaves and possibility. So I guess we might agree then with the writer Stanley Robinson, who pops up a few times, and there's an extended chapter on his dialectics of ecology in this book, when Stan says utopia has gone from being a somewhat minor literary problem to a necessary survival strategy. So trying to think through, I agree with everything that Tom Moylan says, and his work has informed my own. My first book was very much about a kind of literary archaeology, excavating formal and often repressed utopian content within contemporary narratives. But now I think I'm trying to work through these ideas of breaking apart, human subjectivity, smashing it completely into pieces, and realizing, as several people have mentioned, that we have to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway writes. And I just wanted to finish with a kind of question to Tom, I suppose, about this idea, as Heather called it, of dangerous work, of us all working, many of us here work in neoliberal higher education. And I also was really personally kind of touched by particularly the interview, which is the last chapter in the series, that Hugh McConnell did with Tom a few years back, and asking him about his background as an activist and his identity as a scholar, and Tom's reluctance perhaps to use the word academic. And I'm just going to quote a couple of lines from Tom, if I may. He says, "As part of my political and intellectual standpoint, I embraced Herbert Marcuse's great refusal over loyalty to any hegemonic system, universities included. I have always valued what Gary Snyder calls the real work over instrumentalized knowledge or discipline." And I suppose one thing that I wanted to put to Tom, and maybe to all of you here as well, is what some of us obviously do work within higher education, and it is incredibly neoliberal, and these are very dark times for us, the pressures that we're under and the constraints that the government places on us. How do we hold these spaces open, Tom? What resources can we use, and how can we build more people into that rupture or break and process of beginning to become utopian? Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to pass over now to Tom. If he's ready to turn on his mic and camera. Hopefully he is. I think he's still here. Yeah, Tom, can you hear me? Here we go.
He's coming. He's coming. He's here. Oh boy, thank you, Caroline. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening, or whatever time reality you're within. This is really a fantastic gathering, and I'll say right from the beginning, picking up on Caroline's closing question, this gathering is part of my answer to her question, but we'll wind our way back to that. This is a challenge because I want to keep my comments brief so that this great gathering has a chance to engage, but I really want to do justice to what all of you have wonderfully said. So let's get on with it. So thank you, Martin, for moderating, Raffaella, Tim, Heather, and Caroline for your presenting. I'm truly humbled, I'm truly honored by your engagements via your deep interpretive readings of Becoming Utopian. And this is going to lead into just a few prepared comments, and then I'm going to try to move quickly into a more spontaneous reaction to each of your very provocative and challenging and wonderful contributions. As Phil Wegner puts it in his new book, Invoking Hope, as he engages with Pierre Bayard's discussion of non-reading and how to talk about books you haven't read, the practice of interpretive reading or non-reading is at the core of what we do, or what I think we do, as radical critics and teachers. This engaged hermeneutical work transforms our relationship to texts and other practices as it articulates a relational interaction in a flow of skimming, halting, revisiting, rewriting, and reworking through layers of interpretation, as Bayard puts it, in a conversation or a written exchange, animated by the subjectivity of each reader in dialogue with others. I therefore take all of your responses, which you've just given, in this spirit, receiving them in what you, Caroline, describe in your own book as strategies of reading, or what Fred Jameson calls meta-commentary, which he describes as less an interaction with the text itself than the interpretations through which we attempt to confront and appropriate it. For each of you has entered into conversation with this book, and accordingly with yourselves and the world, and created dialectical responses that take us all forward beyond the moment of Becoming's publication, which to me is exactly what I was hoping for. As I hear them, your engagements are richly productive in a dialectical manner. For true to the dialectic, you have preserved the book as it is. You have destroyed it by taking it elsewhere, and you've transformed it from its status as a book into that of a project, which I purposely, a term I use in the Sartrean sense, to elaborate the ongoing process of becoming utopian, which in each of your readings and in your own work, be it in teaching or criticism or activism or design, takes the book beyond the limits of its covers into an ongoing productive engagement in and with the world. So let me try to briefly, if I can, but thoughtfully comment on each of your responses, and to begin with Raffaella's. As ever, Raffaella, you raise the important questions and conjunctions always, and you do it via your own deployment of the subtle knife. The specific questions you raise are important to this larger work of going beyond this book. And I very much value the way you deploy the use of keywords. And of course, here it goes without saying that we've got the shadow and the influence of Raymond Williams, which I think runs through all of my work. The first two keywords you give to me, dialogue and vocation, sum up as you catch most of what the book is about. Your reference to the current dystopian work is important, and that's an ongoing conversation between us and our Dystopia project, and we saw just a great demonstration of it in the wonderful papers and in the Living in the End Times conference last week, and I hope there'll be more discussion on this. I valued your discussion of Comrade, and again, to take Phil's point, your non-reading of it, and this is exactly, again, the engaged methodological approach that I find so valuable. Your unpacking of Comrade into its, via Italian, its fascist and its communist or left meanings, I think is really important. And to me, what I valued about Jody Dean's use of the word comrade is what I value about my use of the word radical, and I'll get back to this in another way in a minute, and that is the retrieval of these terms from their appropriation either by the right or by the center liberal mainstream, which devalues them. So very important. This gets even more important with your discussion of nostalgia and your challenge to me about my hesitation about nostalgia. And of course, I completely agree with you. In here, I want to bring back Bloch's notion of memory and his treatment of nostalgia, where he reminds us that there are two forms. There's a form of memory and retrieval that is conservative, compensatory, that mobilizes a nostalgia that reproduces the current power structure, the current system, or reinforces the move to the right. And then there's a form of memory that taps into what has happened, what has come before, what is nostalgic, and taps its, to use the Bloch term, utopian surplus to bring it alive again in the present. I hear you saying and talking about that second meaning, and I completely agree, and I really value your bringing it up. To me, examples for me would be the Popular Front, which I think is one that we need to think about more these days as we move between singular movements and larger solidarities. And as I think Heather mentioned, Darko's, or was it you, Caroline, mention of the Yugoslavia that has been lost. This is progressive nostalgia. So thank you very much for these contributions. But before I end this response to you and to your comments, I want to take the opportunity to again acknowledge our years of conversation and collaboration. It's been there for a very long time, specifically our work on dystopia and the critical utopia. And if you forgive me, too often scholars and students cite my work on the critical dystopia and miss the fact that this interpretive intervention has always been a collaborative project between us, one in which the term critical dystopia comes from a discussion with Lyman Sargent and from your own groundbreaking essay on it. Your astute criticism has been there all along, and too many have not paid enough attention to it. I hope that is now changing, but for me, I simply want to say thank you again. And I realize in jumping to that, I passed over your other two keywords, your important emphasis on compassion, which you then go on to link very importantly to the strong word kindness, and which I'll link to Phil Wegner's use of the category of love in his work, love being one of the four conditions that Badiou identifies of the utopian, including politics, arts, science, and importantly, love. And the link, of course, to responsibility. That hardly does justice to what you contributed, but it's the beginning or the continuation of a conversation. Tim, you open up an important thread that runs through becoming, and that is the relationship between the personal and the political and the personal, the practice of becoming utopian, the nature and unfolding of utopian energy of activism. And again here, just as Raffaella was reminding us, memory, nostalgia, becomes absolutely important to your presentation, for you are speaking to us of your own becoming. And in your narrative about your work in Oregon in 1992, I was thinking about another literary form that your narrative is an example of, and that is the Latin American Testimonial, the narrative of Latin American subalterns, oppressed peoples, who speak bitterness, who speak truth to power, who through both liberation theology and communist organizing found their voice and spoke forth. Here, the work on the testimony, I'll refer you back to John Beverly and Ileana Rodriguez and the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group. But I thought what you were doing was very much in the spirit of the testimonial. And of course, I think of your march in Oregon of 1992, and I think of the Oregon that exists today. I know it's not a perfect place, but a lot of battles were fought there, and a lot of battles seem to have been won, although there's always more. Again, your evocation of the term love and justice gets back to the Blochian reclamation of these terms, like comrade, like radical, like nostalgia itself. These are important categories that we must claim and hold on to. And then finally, your sense of being part of something bigger. I think this is really important to the experience of becoming utopian in the way I try to talk about it in the book. And this speaks to Caroline's later comments about singularity and togetherness. So your contribution, Tim, recalls the conversation we've long had about Gary Snyder and his evocation of the real work in his poem. And I appreciate your narrative, your testimony of the journey you have taken. It's been a long and winding road, and you've come from outside of academia and now work in the core of the knowledge industry. And here there's resonance with what Heather had to say and what Caroline is asking at the end. For you have that double consciousness, that sense of being a stranger in a familiar land, where you keep one good foot in that larger reality. And of course, this resonates with my own experience dealt with in the book, in the personal intellectual memoirs. And here I noticed that he's in the audience. Hugh O'Connell, I really want to thank you for the interview that you conducted in the last section of the book. There is a simpatico here that I feel with each of you on this, because coming from my own class background, I've always felt with the imposter syndrome. I've always felt that I didn't belong, that I didn't have a voice. And it was only through, and I will say that that's still there, that never really does go away. But of course it gets better, and of course I'm speaking here now to this wonderful group. But that development only comes through solidarity. It only comes through communities of activism, communities of interpretation. It only comes through what Naomi Jacobs calls the beloved community of utopian scholars and activists. That leads me to Heather. And I want to thank you for your contribution, Heather, and for your very important focus on the initial break, the Gestalt shift, and the relationship between that individual subject formation and the larger work that we do. Your evocation, as you so well put it, of our vocation, to go back to Raffaella's term, to cause trouble and stay with it. But importantly, your emphasis on the emotional. I don't think I do enough of that in the book. I don't think it's explored far enough. There is so much more to be done, and indeed has been done, on utopia and affect that I don't deal with and that others have. Susan McManus's work on utopia and affect, and Svetkovich's discussion of exactly that relationship in her wonderful book, Depression of Public Feeling, and all the work on public feeling. This is one of those very important areas that goes beyond the book into the project, that calls for further work, both personally and intellectually. Finally, I'm really delighted that you gave time to talking about Sarah Brown's contribution to this book. This was a really happy development that evolved. I knew I wanted an Irish artist for the book, and I had worked with Sarah on a few art workshops having to do with utopianism. I liked her and I liked her work, and I asked her if she would consider doing the cover. She said she would, but she didn't want her contribution to be simply a representational illustration. She wanted it to be a creative collaboration. To go back to the opening term of my comments, she wanted to provide her own non-reading of the book. She wanted to deal with figuration rather than representation. And so her own project report to an academy in the form of her short film, which supplies the octopus image for the cover and the text taken from Kafka's story, which appears in appendix, is an interpretive engagement with becoming that takes it elsewhere, opens it to possibilities beyond anything I had in mind. The utopian The image of the octopus speaks strongly to me as a creature decidedly non-human. And here we're verging into Caroline's comments and her important new direction. A creature decidedly non-human, yet sentient and possessing a critical capability and agency that goes beyond the limits of the human. The image gets even stronger if you look at Sarah's film, in which the Kafka text that constitutes the academic's resignation from the university and transmutation into the octopus is read this time not by a Germanic male, but rather a female with a beautiful Glaswegian accent. Of course, the multiple critical utopian resonances of this particular becoming are richly challenging, as the tightly sutured, docile academic subject undergoes her own break, casting off her disciplinary sutured formation. And I'm very delighted that this spoke to you so strongly, Heather. To move on to your discussion about the importance of looking back, and here again we have the resonance with nostalgia, with history, with the politics of utopian retrieval, of reaching back for the utopian germs of what has been done, either in success or in failure, very often in failure, but retrieving its utopian surplus. And I like the way you emphasize it. And finally, your discussion of academia and your interrogation of academic freedom. Again, an important exercise in non-reading and in reading in that Blockian spirit of retrieval. I very much valued the way you moved from your interrogation of academic freedom, again, dialectically preserving it, destroying it, and transforming it into a new experience of freedom that goes beyond the limits of the traditional university. So thank you very much for all of those comments. And then finally to Caroline, I really value your comments, Caroline, and your engagement with becoming, from the base of the work you already beautifully and insightfully did in your own book on Utopia and the British novel, your utopian hermeneutics that run through that, your very wonderful essay on hope, which I will cite here as one of the best pieces on hope that I've ever read. But I really value the way you went on to focus on the relationship between humanity and nature. And here again, you break beyond the book into new dimensions, new work. You do exactly what I hoped would be happening. You leave the book behind, and yet you read the book and you take us all elsewhere. On the way, you do add your important discussion of singularity and togetherness, but most importantly, I value your discussion of posthumanism. I speak to that a little bit or quite a bit in the chapter on Kim Stanley Robinson and my discussion on his sense of nature prime, which of course comes out of Ernst Bloch. But you take it much, much further in directions that I simply didn't. You take it drawing on the work of Haraway, drawing on the work of so many others that I simply did not do justice to. And most importantly, you open the book at the level of interpretive practices and politics that are missing in becoming utopian. Queer theory in practice, Black theory in practice, decolonial indigenous work. These are the important directions that, had I whirled enough in time and caught up with myself, I should have and would have been doing, but I didn't. These are gaps, these are silences. And insofar as they are in the world we live, these are failures. But as Beckett says, we fail and fail again, but we keep going. And how do we keep going? And this gets to your closing question. How do we move on within the university? How do we move on as citizens? We do it through precisely this kind of work. this kind of hard, deep interpretation, not surface readings, not purely contained academic readings. Here we're back to Heather's interrogation of the limits of academic freedom as a category, but as deep, engaged, dialectical readings of the texts that we work on and each other's texts and the world itself. We will always be inside. We're never going to be outside, nor would we want to be. But how do we, and how do we work, and how do we keep going within the university? We do it together. We do it through work like this. We do it through the beloved community of this common project, but we do it by hard critique as much as by sympathetic collaboration. Both are important in that collaboration. And that's where I want to end, because I think I've said enough. We've all said enough. It's time for some discussion here. So thank you all very much, and let's move forward.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted, yeah, thanks. People are putting up applause, comments, and emojis for you, Tom. It's weird not being able to hear it. Please do start typing your comments, everybody. Put up your hand if you would like to, and Martin will help feedback. I know we've got, first off the starting blocks, one of our MA students here at Birkbeck, Liam Young, has a question for the panel. Liam, do you want to switch on your video and audio? Oh, and also, sorry, the panel, Heather, Raffaella, and Tim, maybe you could put your video back on for us so we can all see each other. Thanks.
Hi, Caroline. I hope you can see or hear me. Thank you to everybody for the wonderful contributions. And as one of Caroline's students, a special thank you for introducing me to this inspirational community of utopian thinkers. Tom wrote in 2018 that it's not yet the worst of times, but things are getting worse every day, which seems fitting at the moment. I wanted to ask a very contemporary question about the practical application of utopian thinking in the here and now. As governments around the world continue their search for quick fixes or silver bullets to the coronavirus crisis, how can we remain utopian at a time when the necessary response to this crisis, which I would suggest includes genuine international cooperation, universal healthcare, and fair distribution of the vaccine, seems like such a distant hope? Thank you.
Tom, do you want to start off with the response?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Liam. And first of all, Liam, apologies for my not writing back to you. I owe you book lists and discussions, but because of all this, that hasn't happened, but it will. It's an asymptote, not a dead end. It's a key question, and it is the question I think we're all asking ourselves. If we simply look for that big systemic transformation, it's simply not going to happen until we do the little work along the way. There has to be that balance between the small steps here and now in immediate struggles with an eye on the prize of the bigger horizon. We have to engage as intellectuals, as teachers, as activists in our neighborhoods, in our nations, in our regions, in immediate struggles, whatever they are, but always trying to add our way of thinking in a larger scale. I'm not saying anything anyone would not already say. I guess I'd point to Kim Stanley Robinson's work as one fine example of the sort of thought experiments between the immediate steps of the present and the larger transformations. Because through his body of work, Stan has been thinking through this project all along. And his recent book, Ministry of the Future, really is a compendium. He argues that it's still a novel, and I would agree with him, it is still a novel. But it reads like an academic miscellany because it's got essays, it's got theoretical material, it's got narrative, and so forth. Dealing with the immediate struggles of a high-level UN NGO leader and an activist. And he's working out theory, importantly, not simply ecological theory, but this time finance theory. His treatment of the banks and the way the banks can and should work is an important contribution, not just to literary imagination, but to practical politics. So we need more. We need to learn more. It's only the beginning, Liam.
And Heather and Tim, did you want to come in on that as well? Both of you talked about the relationship between activism and scholarship and that dual identity. Tim, maybe?
Yeah, the connection between activism and academia is always such a sort of fraught one, but I think the important thing about activists is that they're reading seriously and they're reading deeply and they're putting academic work out in the world in many ways. And one of the things I think we need to do as academics is to close that loop so that the discussion between academics and activists is a constant and ongoing one. I guess the other thing that I would say about activism is that when Tom spoke of affect and such, you know, it brings all of that to our work. It's emotional. It's work of affect. It's tiring. You feel it in the body, and so that very visceral sense. And the shared vulnerability of activism is something I think that's very, very important to bear in mind. The other thing about activism is you've got to tell relatively simple and emotional stories too, in order to move things, forward. And this is, I think, why I find it so important to speak in the first person and to speak through intellectual biography, because we can't move the world by pretending to objectivity all the time and you know, hiding our voices. So all of that, I think, is part of this call to action, and I think it's all there in Tom's work too.
And that call to the personal, Tim, I mean, that really challenges the neoliberal marketization of higher education that we're particularly aware of in the UK, but obviously in other countries where tuition fees are high as well. It really goes against, you know, one human communicating with another and sharing vulnerability in a safe classroom space with your students when you are expected to deliver content, be some sort of figure of authority, and the students are paying to receive it. It's incredibly hard, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's this idea actually, which Paulo Freire talks about, you know, that we've got on the one hand extraction and on the other hand decision, and that's the way the neoliberal institution sees the work of education. You know, you're extracting money from the wallets of the students and you're plopping some knowledge in their heads and off they go. And yet, the work of education is immensely emotional. You know, it's about human connections, about developing the whole person, because education is ultimately a practice of futurity. It's about creating the minds and bodies that will inhabit and build the future for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Phil Wegner's got a question here. Did you want to pop your mic on, Phil? And maybe your camera too, if you want to say hi.
Sure. Did it come on? Am I here? Oh, good. Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say hi. No, it was just a very quick little observation building on what Tim was saying very importantly. But I think now more than ever, and I think these intersecting projects, Tom's very much is bearing this out, that the university is very much in the world. And that the question of the connection between the work we do as scholars is even more significantly than earlier moments, deeply connected to the situation of the university. And it's precisely, I think, that separation that underscores some conservative turns towards formalisms and surface readings and other kinds of things, is to hide that deep link. And I just wanted to add that to what Tim was saying, and if he had any other comments on that. Thank you.
Can I come in for a second for a comment?
Yes, please do, Raffaella.
Yeah, no, I just thinking about what Tim said, and also looking at the chat, what Lawrence Davis is also asking, you know, and the first question about the coronavirus moment. I think that you know, once again, you know, we're facing the difficulty now of, you know, our teaching is all online, and so we're not even seeing the students, you know, and that's even more difficult to some extent. At the same time, we've seen, you know, in the wonderful Cappadocia conference, and even tonight, you know, we're here from all, you know, all over the places. So, I mean, the technology helps, but also creates, in a way, walls and difficulties.
Yeah, I was just typing my response, Raffaella. I think that this, because the original question, I think, from Liam was, how do we hope through the pandemic? And I think that obviously there was perhaps a slightly more utopian moment earlier in the first lockdowns, but the use of technology, the fact that we're able to gather together colleagues and friends who normally we wouldn't be able to see one another that easily. It costs an enormous amount to go to academic conferences. And I really think that that model of ceaseless travel was already broken before the coronavirus pandemic happened. We all realized it's amoral and environmental and carbon related terms to just be flying around to all these expensive conferences. That ceaseless academic cycle of production doesn't work. So these technologies help us to open up these spaces, and we really need to hold on to this, don't we, after, you know, the lockdowns end. Heather, I'm aware that you may want to come into the question about holding open spaces of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, I think a lot of the stuff about saying the barriers that people are speaking to kind of between staff and students, I just feel that as a place to start, and like I said, between staff and other staff in the university itself, before we can even get stuff out, you know, kind of break out of the walls, how can we do that if we don't start from where we are, you know? And it's what we have seen, especially at numerous universities while the pandemic is happening, is a real strengthening of bonds between unions, between students' unions and trade unions, and between different trade unions. We've been seeing academic unions speaking out on behalf of like staff who are being outsourced and lose their jobs. And we've seen, while we talk so much, there's so much we learn from failure, but small successes that we're seeing as well. We're seeing management backing down on some things. We're seeing at Sussex, you know, some staff like they got to keep their jobs at least over Christmas, you know, that we'd have lost them otherwise. So I think that, you know, we can look around us and find hope in that connection within the universities. And I think staff and students are thinking the same things, but being held apart a lot. And maybe unions are places where this can happen, but they're also problematic structures with their own legacies. So there needs to be a lot of critical utopian work done within them. I don't talk too much about it, but yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. We'll probably circle back to that because it'll be really interesting to hear a bit more about those interconnections and different traditions and hierarchies. I think Martin's collated a couple of questions that we may have missed so far. Do you want to feed them through, Martin?
Yeah, I think Martin's got a pretty tough job to try and synthesize these questions into. The discussion's been quite rich. Robert Hunter, I think, came in on something that was discussed just a while back, that there was a moment in the lockdown where there was fertile ground for imagining new normals that might be better normals. But then obviously there's a suggestion that that might now have evaporated. I think Lawrence, Robert, do you want to come in?
Yeah, do you want to turn your video on?
Yeah, I can jump in. It was actually right. It was Ruth who made the comment, so she might want to speak to it. Don't know
Yep, we can hear you. We can see you sideways as well.
The video's weird. The video's
yes.
weird.
So
Never
just
mind
listen to
about
us.
that. No, I was thinking in terms of you know, the issue of doorstepping and just the kind of conversations with neighbours about how the insanity of the way we live has been revealed, and although well, I just wondered to what extent the panel really did think that what Arundhati Roy called the portal into the new world had closed over. I mean, to some extent it clearly has, because officially we're supposed to be going back to a new normal with, you know, to the old normal because of the vaccine. But I'm not, I think that to some extent the sort of public mood is still open to talking about the new normal, and I have had several such conversations, notwithstanding being locked down, actually on doorsteps with neighbours, and I wondered how other people were experiencing that.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Anyone want to come in on that from the panel?
Okay. I was, yeah, I think what you say is so true. I mean, I actually spoke to one of my neighbours about Block, and we, like, our community on the street of people who didn't really know each other have developed this, like, rapport, and we come out into the street and people are using the word hope, and they were talking about hope. And my downstairs neighbour now wants to marry Block. I've explained that it's no longer possible, but, you know, I think in a connection with the community, I think there is a hunger for things not to go back to the way they were. I really do, and I think that's quite exciting, and we shouldn't let that slip away.
Tom?
Yeah, I'd agree, Ruth and Heather. And again, I think this speaks to the sort of work we do as cultural critics and as, and it's a word I'm comfortable with, organizers. Doorstepping is important, and I forgot to get back to that in Tim's comments. It is the work we do in our conversations, but what do? We employ the very method that you wrote about, Ruth. We employ the way of reading the situation that teases out, and again, back to Raffaella and nostalgia, the still utopian possibilities that were there in the early stages of the lockdown. And we need to help develop that memory. We need to help bring that memory aside. What I find happening here in Ireland, we'll see what Lawrence thinks, is in our third surge, as things have gotten worse, people have gone back to more of a sense of doing things differently in the future. I think there was a sense in the first surge moving into the second where exhaustion came, let's all settle back, and that nothing will really change. But there's still possibilities there. But it's our job as cultural critics, and it's our job as political organizers to keep raising those issues and to start looking for ways to do it. And just finally, what you just said, Caroline, about the use of these meetings. This is a dialectical historical breakthrough. We are finding new ways to meet with each other. The Living in the End Times Conference and this one are good examples, as are the Utopian Studies ones. And we need to retain that and not just turn our cameras off. Yeah, absolutely. And I think Emma is here with us somewhere as well. It's great that there was a conversation, what was it, 2 weeks ago at the Living in the End Times conference. So that feeling that we can connect these discussions a bit more regularly, I think is incredibly important. Tim, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit to the fact that not only have doorsteps become tangible, but so has the space of the street, so have the shared public spaces that we use, like parks and such, have become really central. And I think that one thing that is incredibly valuable to that is that it has reminded us that politics takes place in the public realm, you know, actually in the spaces that we occupy, that politics is between bodies and in spaces, and it's not an abstraction. So, you know, when we talk about people in Westminster or on Capitol Hill playing politics, in fact, they're not. They're bandying about abstractions, and they're working with influence. Where politics takes place is in the polis, is in the spaces that we occupy. So re-engaging with that, I think, has been incredibly valuable. One thing I'll say as well is that I worry about the power of forgetting. I think we'll forget about the pandemic quickly, but perhaps the thing that makes this slightly different is that we came into this pandemic with a heightened awareness of climate change, environmental breakdown, biodiversity loss, and the racial nature of so much of that and the impacts of so much of that through Black Lives Matter. So the stage was set slightly differently for this pandemic than it was for the last one, for the AIDS pandemic. So I expect something slightly different from the outcome.
Thank you. Martin's got 3 questions, I think, collated from the chat.
I think they're related to one another. I mean, Deborah was reflecting on the proliferation of utopias and the difficulty of synthesizing different views into single goals that are achievable. While Lawrence has talked of the importance of mentorship and role models in the process of becoming utopian, while Hadas was asking about whether these more fantastical metaphors of octopuses and spores provide models for utopian thinking. So really, this seems to be about how we collectivize sets of diverse utopian thought, and what kind of mentorship or inspirations can we take in moving towards those. Hope I've done justice to people's quite detailed comments there.
Thanks, Martin. And if any of those questioners want to stick their hands up and we've misconstrued what you're asking, please do. If I could kick off with the octopus, I mean, the octopus has such a long kind of rich cultural history of being mobilized as a signifier to represent threat to various different national interests during, you know, the Second World War, sort of the spread of communism. It's obviously an iconic signifier of the weird, the monstrous, the strange, the Cthulhu-like Lovecraftian world that threatens humanity. It's now become popularized in popular culture so that you can get twee knitted little octopuses for babies on Etsy and things like that. But yeah, I think it's you know, it's important, and it adorns the cover of Tom's book. It's an important one precisely because people, you know, have been recognizing increasingly the intelligence of different species to ourselves, and the shortcomings of an anthropocentric way of thinking and knowledge production that cannot articulate or identify alien and ulterior kinds of knowledge. So, I mean, another example, to come back to the spores, the mycelium, the slime molds, you know, there's some really fantastic work on fungal and microbial lives at the moment. Slime molds are being utilized in scientific research with industrial applications. I mean, parts of sort of green technology and capitalists and things like that, but they're being used, you know, to do urban planning and think about road networks. And people are starting to understand that they have this incredibly powerful collective form of knowledge and sharing resources and things like that. So they are very popular figures of many post-humanist thinkers, I would say, and they should rightly be part of our utopian conversation too, and they have been studied by lots of people working in science fiction scholarship. I don't know if Hugh O'Connell is with us and wants to chip in on that, because he probably knows more about it than I do. Or any of the other panelists want to talk about spores and liberating spores and octopus tentacles. Tim?
Oops. Yeah, actually, I think from the standpoint of posthumanism, a couple of excellent mentions along the way were of Astrida Neimanis's work. Elspeth Probyn was mentioned, and I adore her work. She's an incredibly perspicacious scholar. But I think what that work does, being able to think through spores and tentacles and our watery beings, what that provides us is not evidence of that old anarchist slogan that another world is possible. Rather, it says that another world is present, that we haven't yet learned to see. And the utopian potential of that is just absolutely thrilling, to think that there might be intelligences in the universe that we don't yet know how to see or contemplate or engage with.
Tom.
Yeah, am I on? Yeah, I'd agree. Where do I want to go with this? There is the octopus as metaphor for us humans, and here there's that work of retrieval of the image of the octopus from what you described, Caroline, as the oppressive figure into a figure of a new way of being. And what Sarah Brown is inviting us to think about is exactly what Tim suggested: our allies on the planet that are not human, and all the important work being done on the non-human, but also as a way of sliding into a hybridity, an invitation to us to become more octopus-like, to become less rigid, binary, fixated with our head at the top and our limbs dangling down, to become this fluid creature. And that gets to Lawrence's point about mentoring. If I can push it, I think we have to take the octopus as our mentor in terms of new ways to be human. But to get back to the core of Lawrence's question, I think this gets down to, again, the pedagogical. It's absolutely important to think of our work as mentors, not in an oppressive, authoritarian way, but as in a Freirean way, in a dialogic way. A lot of us, all of us have memories, all of us have history, all of us, as Heather so well and you so well pointed out, Tim, have had our struggles. And we need to tell those stories. We need to tell those stories to new people, not war stories to say, oh, my word, we got through this, you will too, but as lessons that you get in that wonderful set of short stories, the Zapatistas tales that I teach a lot. So, and then one final thing to look ahead to our work. I think there's going to be a lot of room coming out of the pandemic, if and when this pandemic, because there will be more, because it is connected to climate change. What can we do as cultural workers to generate histories, to generate our own testimonials of living through the pandemic that are not simply stories of survival, but stories of possibilities, how people could do things better? We need to be doing that work, and that calls for collective work.
Thanks, Tom. Heather, you put your hand up a minute ago.
Yeah, I was just thinking back, and comments will be wonderful. To the octopus. So this idea that I felt when I was doing my own kind of reading, I'm reading obviously with all of your work on blog, and I initially came to this like we were all struggling to be human, and it feels like now that we've come to this point, like 5 years later, I know I've not been doing this very long, but all of a sudden we're not wanting to be human. We're rejecting humanity. We don't want to be what we are because we're so repulsed by it. And I think even looking outside for the mentor to and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but I think we need to kind of understand our own kind of species being, like that we are and that getting back to that idea of we need to understand ourselves as a human animal. And as much as we want to reject that by this kind of becoming all these other wonderful animals that that can see with their skin. We still need to kind of sit with this and what we are and what we've done. But I think there is, and I think that is through sharing stories and knowing ourselves, because that's the only way we can know our own histories. And there's a lot of a bunch of activist work in archiving and things like that as well. It's very again coming back to non-violent activism, remembering and sharing our own histories.
That idea of of the human animal, I mean, it's something that comes up quite a bit in Maggie G's work, who's not been mentioned yet, but ought to be mentioned as a utopian contemporary writer. And particularly in her biography, My Animal Life, there's some really beautiful kind of poetic passages about thinking through alternative temporalities to the scale of anthropocentric human history. Can I ask Lucy Sargison if you want to turn on your mic and ask your question? So she's typed a question, but maybe we could see Lucy. Not really. Okay, no worries. So Lucy asks the panel, I'm thinking about becoming and being, about walking, staggering, crawling our talk. Maybe it's walking, staggering, crawling with our eyes on the horizon and our feet on the ground. Tom, did you want to reply to that?
Yes. And thank you, Lucy. Of course, because you have that wonderful sense in your own sense of being utopian, of our being utopian as embodied. That's been there in your work all along, and it continues to be there in your work. And this is a beautiful statement from you that comes right out of the core of what you've been teaching us all along. And exactly that, to walk, stagger, crawl with our eyes on the horizon and our feet on the ground. That needs to be created as a banner. I'll simply say yes.
And we've got a question from Dunja. Did you want to ask it yourself, Dunja, or do you prefer me to read it out?
I'm not sure whether you can hear me well.
We can hear you.
Oh, right, that's great. So I was wondering, because I just recently read the collection by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Lawrence Well, and they were talking about grey ecology, where there are a couple of contributors, of course, and I was wondering whether there is a utopian element of becoming in grey ecology or prismatic ecology. Perhaps any one of you could comment.
Tim is nodding.
The idea of becoming, it's interesting that we haven't spoken directly about becoming because it's in the title, but I'm fond of talking about not just human being but human becoming, how we develop, how we grow, and what we are aiming towards. The really important thing, and maybe this ties back to earlier questions too, is that we become individually, but we also become together as humans and through our ways of knowing and communicating, but also as an animal species, that we build and grow through practices of mutual aid. And when you look at our core principles, all of them have to do with collectivity, and all of them have to do with becoming together. I spoke about love and justice. Another thing I didn't speak about, but probably ought to have done, is the idea of freedom. Freedom, which is so fundamentally important and which is often treated as an abstraction. Freedom is something that we give to each other. It's mutually assured. We look after our freedoms for each other, and that's partially, I think, in our function as an animal species. If we talk, for example, about being free as a bird, what gives a bird freedom? The air, the food they have, the support of their own species, the mother who sits on the egg, all of these things are what guarantee the freedom. So it's just about kind of unpacking the questions in their largest sense in order to think about what becoming really means to us.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that one, Tim, because it's really struck me, being a more recent convert into posthumanist theory, having slightly sidestepped cyborgian posthumanism for various reasons and going in the ecological route, just how central Deleuzian and Guattarian thinking is to literally every posthumanist scholar I read. Everybody is writing about these kinds of ideas of process, of continual becoming, of rhizomatic connections, and so forth. And I'm not aware, but maybe Tom could correct me, of apart from possibly Vince Goguen, of anybody writing a comparative analysis of Bloch's ideas of becoming and Deleuzian becoming. I don't know whether Deleuze would have been familiar with Bloch at all when he was writing. And I'm aware that Jack Sipes has a really nice point, and it might be in his introduction to the collection on utopian literature, the essays on utopian literature, where he says that Bloch was a precursor to deconstruction. But that's a part of the Blochian heritage that I think remains yet to be explored and ought to be explored, actually.
Yeah, I'd agree, Caroline. I don't think anyone has really done that. Phil probably does it to more of an extent in his literary studies. It's there in Jack. Vince touches on it, but probably right now the person who's done it the most has been Phil, but I think no one has really addressed it as a project, and I think there's something waiting to be done.
I'm aware that we haven't heard from Raffaella in a little while. I just wanted to check if you're still with us, Raffaella, and did you want to come back to the discussion?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. No, I was thinking, as you were speaking, for one thing, it's difficult to disagree, so I just don't want to repeat the same things. So, but I was thinking about the work of Octavia Butler. For me, I return to the work of Octavia Butler a lot, especially in these days, I think, in terms of alliances and the difficulty, though, also of building those alliances. It's not, it takes a lot of compromise and mediation and negotiation, to do so. So that would be, my contribution on this.
Thank you. We're just coming up to 8 o'clock now. So unless anybody has a really burning question, I don't think anybody has. We've had a lot of thanks when a few people are leaving. It just leaves me then to thank our panel. This has been such a rich discussion. I think we all need, ideas about becoming utopian and utopian succor. And I think you call it muscularity, Tom, developing utopian muscularity. We have to use that muscle regularly, and we have to grow it and build it collectively. And I've particularly enjoyed tonight's discussion. I really hope other people attending have also. Somebody asked about the roundtable for Phil's new book, which Tom will be in attendance at, I think. That's next Friday, is that right? I can't quite remember.
Yes, it's the Society for Utopian Studies roundtable. If you, Pete Sands can send out the information, but it is scheduled for next Friday, I think, beginning at 5 o'clock GMT. But you'd have to check that. But it's on Phil's Invoking Hope. It's another chapter in this ongoing work that we're all doing.
So if anybody on here would love to come to that and don't quite know where to find it, you can always email myself or any of the panelists, and or tweet us if we're on Twitter. We'd be more than happy to point you in the right direction. There's a link and you can get a ticket at the moment. But yeah, so silent applause. Thank you so much to Tom Moylan, Tim Waterman, Raffaella Baccolini, and also Heather McKnight. I've been Caroline Edwards. This always feels like some kind of radio DJ set doing this live. But yeah, I guess we'll all meet again soon and keep these spaces open. So thanks everybody. Take care, and I'll say bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
You.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Okay.